Hey folks, Seth here. As we watch cities burn, statues being torn down, and calls to defund the police, if you haven't already, it may be time to think about personal protection. Guns Etc. has 10,200 square feet of guns, ammo, safes, and a staff that will work with you to find the best firearm for your situation. So stop by their huge store in Mesa or click on gunsetc.com and have access to over $400 million in firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy July 8th. A caller recently asked me to tell the story of my political conversion from left to right. I'm not sure it's that unique, but I'm happy to do it because I think they relate very well to the times we're living in now. My biggest worry these days is it may not be replicable for others, at least not in the way I did it. So we're going to have to find other ways for other people. That's a worry, anyway. I'm not exactly sure when I first realized it was serious time to question the left. As some of you know, the left is where I grew up, what I grew up in. I was a member of the Youth Socialist Alliance, actually, and went off to college thinking I would bolster my left-wing bona fides and help change the world. I was committed to helping the poor. I believed in keeping sacrosanct the Bill of Rights, and I loathed racism. I was a big believer in human rights. I thought welfare should be expanded to help the poor. I thought drugs should be legalized. I thought our military buildup was a bad idea and came at the cost of helping the poor, especially minorities. And I thought tax reform should mean taxing the wealthier more. I think my first questioning of the left I associated with was when I entered a socialist bookstore, and the first book I saw prominently on display was titled The Zionist Lie, or something like that. I leafed through it, and I saw the whole book was itself basically a lie, an anti-Israel screed that swallowed whole the PLO line that Israel should not exist and that it existed at the expense of Palestinian human and civil rights. But I had been to Israel and studied that part of the world, and I knew what terrorism was, having studied that as well, as it always fascinated me. And I knew that if human rights were a concern, Israel was the answer, not the problem. That there was no country in the world, and there still isn't, that grants minorities, especially Arabs, more civil and human rights than any other in the Middle East, or perhaps the world outside of America and perhaps in some countries in Europe. The more I looked into it, the more uneasy I became with my socialist credentials as I realized the entirety of the PLO, a terrorist movement, and particularly Yasser Arafat, a terrorist, and every single branch of the PLO affiliated with socialism, and put itself in league with self-declared socialist movements and countries around the world. I suppose the second thing that got me was a jarring incident that had me seriously and for the first time wonder about how to go about ending racism. I was a freshman in college and took an upper-class psychology course. On my first paper, I received a B-. I had a friend, a senior. I asked if I could see his paper because he got an A-. It was one of the worst things I ever read, not necessarily in its conclusions. I could scarcely get to those, for it was close to illiterate, full of grammatical and spelling errors, just chock full of them. Had I turned in a piece of writing like that in the 8th grade, I'd have gotten an F. This was college. He was a senior. I went to meet my professor to discuss all this. She said something almost exactly like this verbatim, quote, "Your paper was a good start. This is an upper-level course. You're just not there yet, and you should have integrated X, Y, Z thoughts, whatever they were," close quote. I asked about my friend getting an A-. She said, quote, "Well, I know his background, where he came from. I've had him in my class before, and he's just grown so much, but you have to understand his background," close quote. What was his background was question number one. Hispanic American, South Central Los Angeles. It was something I never thought of. He was just my friend. The second thing I thought, how come the professor didn't give a damn about my background? I don't have a great word for it, but my friend and I were each judged by our race, by our races. I didn't have a good phrase for it then, but Shelby Steele some years later would write exactly what this was, as would George W. Bush. Steele's line about race-based judgments in education leading to what was generally known as affirmative action was the permanent stigma of questionable competence. Bush's line was the soft bigotry of low expectations. But I knew then, before either of these phrases were known to me, that this was all just plain wrong. I had grown up knowing well the then famous Bakke case, and my family was very committed to civil rights, teaching me a ton about Martin Luther King Jr. The Bakke case cited the language I loved and that all Americans should love. Quote, distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature odious to a free people, especially a people dedicated to the notion of equality, close quote. I got a quick lesson on what Bakke went through, and I got a quick lesson on soft bigotry, judgments by skin color, and permanent stigmas. I became the editor of my college's newspaper. Actually, it was 5 colleges and 1 paper. And there was a famous conservative professor. I thought he was a right-wing nut. He had written some odious op-eds, I had thought, and he was to deliver a major speech that was being well promoted. It was titled "The Reichstag is Still Burning." You can get it online today. It was on the problems inherent in higher education. I decided I'd go and cover it and see what this idiot was all about. I knew only a little about him then, namely that his expertise was Aristotle and that he had written Barry Goldwater's famous 1964 speech with the lines, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." I went to the auditorium and I recall another professor, Charles Kessler, introducing him. The date was April 14th, because as Kessler concluded his introduction, he said, quote, "It is odd that we do this here today on the anniversary of the shooting of Harry Jaffa's favorite political figure, Abraham Lincoln. The difference between Jaffa and Lincoln, though, is that Harry would have shot back." Close quote. I didn't know Jaffa was a Lincoln lover, much less scholar. But Jaffa approached the microphone and said, "Can everybody hear me?" At which point about 25 students stood up with signs that read "Silence equals death" and walked out as a form of protest against him and his point of view. I then wrote an editorial on all that, writing, quote, "While Harry Jaffa's views are abominable, the protesters should have heard him out and confronted him with questions, because after all, as they said, silence equals death." The day that op-ed printed, I got a call from Dr. Jaffa. He said, "So you think my views are abominable? How about a debate?" I said, "Sir, I'm just a snot-nosed sophomore. You're a world-renowned intellect. I'm not going to debate you." He said, "Well, how about a cup of coffee?" How could I turn that down? So we met for coffee and talked, probably for about 3 hours. I took a class of his. I visited him in his office, often to challenge him, and he walked me through a tour of conservative thought I'd never been exposed to, starting with Commentary Magazine and his essays. He gave me his essays on every question I had and spent hours with me discussing them. Long and short, he took my hand, I grabbed it, and never let go. Long and short, I'd never even been exposed to conservative intellectualism. And what did I learn on the way? In short, to use a quote I always love from Dennis Teddy, a scholar in Washington, D.C., Walter Burns, another great professor and student of Leo Strauss's, like Jaffa, Walter Burns taught me a professor could love America. Harry Jaffa taught me why. I learned all about how our founding was beautiful and unique. I learned that if I cared about the poor, 2 things mattered: family and education. I learned that if I cared about the poor, the current welfare system, which endowed fatherlessness, was about the worst thing to do for and to the poor. I learned that school choice and excellence in education was not to be found in the current education system, which had no accountability, but cost ever greater amounts to produce ever less quality. I learned that if I cared about equality and racism, or Declaration of Independence, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, they were the ones that showed the way. That to get beyond race, we have to get beyond race. That segregation is a badge of slavery, and integration is the way out. And that socialists re-embraced the former, while we conservatives support the latter. I learned that if I care about things like the Bill of Rights, minority rights, freedom of association and thought, places like the Soviet Union were the true repressors and oppressors, and that I had been reading propaganda and not listening to their dissidents. that just because something says pravda, truth, it doesn't mean it is. I learned that if I care about maintaining this, the last best hope of Earth, the military was the beginning of saving it. Not the problem, but a critical necessity, and that those who loathed it were in league with those who loathed liberty and equality and all I held dear. I learned, in short, an awful lot. So my worry, they don't make professors like Harry Jaffa anymore, world-class scholars, never mind professors who take that kind of one-on-one time with students. So as you know, I've proposed something else for our evangelization. It's borrowed from the ex-slavery movement. Each one, teach one. It's actually a beautiful sentiment born from a terrible past. Wikipedia defines it well, as I understood it and long have. The phrase originated when African Americans were denied education, including learning to read. Many, if not most, enslaved people were kept in a state of ignorance about anything beyond their immediate circumstances, which were under control of owners, the lawmakers, and of course the authorities. When an enslaved person learned or was taught to read, it became his or her duty to teach someone else, spawning the phrase, each one, teach one. That's where we are today on the political, ideological spectrum, with the left denying our ability to educate, speak, or teach. So we have to do it ourselves, individually, especially those of us who crossed ideological Rubicons ourselves and left the ideological reservations and plantations of the left. And I suggest we start on the issue of race. It is the dominant issue of our time. It is the issue the left thinks can be used against us, and it is fraught with hypocrisy and idiocy and, ironically enough, actual racism. You see, I still think King was right, as I think Frederick Douglass was, and as I think Benjamin Curtis was in his great dissent in the Dred Scott decision, where he wrote, "To allege that the founders intended to say that the creator of all men had endowed the white race exclusively with the great natural rights which the Declaration of Independence asserts is a reproach of inconsistency. That whole notion," he said, "was a violation of natural right." And he pointed out, quote, "It has been often asserted that the Constitution was made exclusively by and for the white race. We have already shown that several states of the original, in them, colored persons then possessed the elective franchise and were among those by whom the Constitution was ordained and established. If so, it is not true in point of fact that the Constitution was made exclusively by the white race, and that it was made exclusively for the white race is, in my opinion, not only an assumption not warranted by anything in the Constitution, but contradicted by its opening declaration that it was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves and their posterity. And as free colored persons were then citizens of several states, and so in every sense part of the people of the United States, they were among those for whom and whose posterity the Constitution was ordained and established." The left today can embrace the history of America, Roger B. Taney, and the majority Dred Scott decision. I just never have, and I never will. I'm Seth Leibson. The lines are open.